Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. I'm going to give it a minute or so to allow for more people to join, and then we'll get started on the agenda. Okay, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition, and I want to welcome you to today's HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable homes. It is a holiday week, and I think many people may have already begun their week's celebrations or vacations. So I do expect a somewhat smaller call today in terms of registrants and participants, but as a reminder for everybody, including our speakers, we are recording the conversation and we'll make the conversation itself and all the materials available to our broader network after the call. And I do expect we'll have plenty of people watching either live or archived. So we last met just before the elections and clearly had some pretty significant results with plenty of impacts on our ability to move forward our affordable housing and our HoUSed campaign agenda. Later in the call, we'll hear more from Sarah Sadian on some of the specifics, what it means for our lame duck agenda and what it means for our HoUSed campaign agenda next year in the new Congress. We'll hear more about that later. I will say that one thing that is clear, maybe the only thing that is very clear, is that we still have 2 more years of the Biden-Harris administration, and that they are really eager to do more on affordable housing. Last week, there were 2 meetings at the White House that I and others from NLHC had the opportunity to participate in. 2 meetings in 1 week at the White House on affordable housing and tenant protections, which I can't recall another administration where that happened. And it was the 3rd White House meeting that I attended in about 6 weeks. So really across the administration, they're working hard to figure out within their authority what more they can do to protect tenants and to increase housing supply. So the first meeting last week was on Monday, and it was on the topic of tenant protections. And from the White House, the participants were Brian Deese, who is the director of the National Economic Council, Susan Rice, who's the director of the Domestic Policy Council, Erica Pothig from the Domestic Policy Council, Gene Sperling, senior advisor to President Biden, and many others from multiple agencies within the administration attended. And then invited externally were tenant leaders, impacted people, organizers, national housing advocacy organizations like the National Income Housing Coalition, researchers, and fair housing advocates were participating as well. There were about 80 people altogether, and the topic was tenant protections because the administration has been looking at where they can do more to rebalance power, as the HoUSed agenda, as the HoUSed campaign has been calling for, to rebalance the power that tilts so heavily in favor of landlords at the expense of low-income renters. And it was a very productive conversation. At the National Income Housing Coalition, we were really delighted to be able to bring with us, because they were invited by the White House themselves, some tenant leaders that we work closely with that are part of NLHC's tenant leader cohort, and in many cases also part of the National Income Housing Coalition's board of directors. So there were about 10 tenant leaders from NLIHC's tenant leader cohort that participated in this White House meeting, either in person or virtually, including Ms. Geraldine Collins, who's on the board of NLIHC, and she's the current executive director of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, and she was on a panel discussion at this White House meeting talking about the need for tenant protections. So it was a really productive meeting. We're looking forward to next steps out of the White House and expecting sometime over the next month that we may hear more from them about some specifics for what they're looking to put forward on tenant protections. The other meeting at the White House that I attended was on Wednesday last week, and this one was in the Roosevelt Room of the West Wing of the White House, and it was on the topic of housing supply. It was a much smaller meeting. This was 12 CEOs of mostly housing industry groups like the Mortgage Bankers Association, National Multifamily Housing Council, National Housing Conference, Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, and some others. And the purpose of the meeting was a follow-up to one that we had back in late September. The meeting was with Brian Deese, again, director of the National Economic Council, with Susan Rice, director of the Domestic Policy Council, with Secretary Marcia Fudge, with FHFA Director Sandra Thompson, and with Gene Sperling, Senior Advisor to the White House. And it was another really productive conversation about what we all can align on in terms of an agenda for the lame duck Congress. And we talked, as we'll hear from Sarah again later in this conversation, as we've heard from her on multiple calls recently, our agenda to increase the funding level for housing choice vouchers to get the highest possible number of incremental vouchers. And we talked about the need to not only expand, but reform the low-income housing tax credit program so that new units can be affordable to the people most in need, extremely low-income households. And we talked a little bit about the White House and our organizational agendas for the new Congress, but also a really productive meeting. And again, really what I take out of both of them and it is the commitment across the Biden-Harris administration to do more on affordable housing. So we'll have a lot more opportunities in the coming weeks and months and into the next Congress to continue working with them to advance some of our priorities within the House campaign agenda. So with that update, I am going to now move into our agenda for this call. And I'm going to welcome our first speaker, who's Bhavya Mohan. She is with the U.S. General Services Administration, and she's here to talk about a study that they've done on emergency rental assistance and equity in the distribution of ERA. So Bhavya, thank you so much for joining today's call, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And thank you, Diane and NLIHC for this invitation. So today I will be talking about equity in the distribution of ERA. And this is a collaboration between the Office of Evaluation Sciences and Treasury. So next slide. So first, just to hear a quick introduction on who we are. So I work for OES, and we are a team of interdisciplinary experts. We work across the federal government to help agencies build and use evidence. And we partner with federal agencies to answer priority questions using rigorous evaluation methods as well as administrative data. So next slide. So our portfolio has spanned a variety of different areas, such as retirement security, reducing the cost of government operations, and many more. And OES is conducting evaluations on ARP-funded programs with equity goals in order to build evidence about what works and what doesn't to build an equitable recovery. So these evaluations will answer key questions raised in the American Rescue Plan Equity Learning Agenda. So next slide. So for this project, OES worked with the Department of Treasury to conduct a descriptive study of the ERA program. And this study specifically asks, how do demographics of renters who received ERA compare to the demographics of renters who were eligible for ERA? So next slide. Thank you. So research prior to the pandemic shows that Black and women renters represented a disproportionate share of those served with eviction filings. And equitable access to emergency relief is a congressional and administration priority that is reflected in Treasury guidance. So this study builds on existing evidence by comparing demographics of recipients of ERA to those who are eligible for ERA. And we predicted that the characteristics of renters that are eligible for ERA based on whether they meet ERA eligibility criteria. So specifically, have a household income of less than or equal to 80% of area median income, experienced financial hardship due to the pandemic, and who are at risk of homelessness or housing instability. So next slide. So now I'm going to discuss the data and the methods that we used for the study. So next slide, thank you. So first, I'm going to briefly discuss how we estimated demographics for recipients. So over 3.7 million renters applied for and received ERA between Q1 of 2021 and Q2 of 2022. And they self-reported their demographic information during the application process. Subsequently, ERA grantees collated and reported recipient data to Treasury. Now, HoUSed compiled this data from Treasury and identified missing observations, since not all grantees reported demographic data for all quarters of ERA that they distributed. So HoUSed used two main techniques to address missingness. First, where a demographic category was only partially missing for a given grantee, we used the demographic reports available for that grantee to fill in for those that were missing. Second, where we had data on the addresses of a grantee's ERA recipients, but no direct demographic reports, we imputed the demographics of that grantee's recipients based on the demographics of renters in the areas in which money was spent. So this gave us demographic estimates for the recipients. So next slide. So next, I'm going to discuss how we estimated demographics for those who are eligible for ERA. So different census surveys presented different data quality issues. So for instance, the 2015 to 2019 ACS IPUMS data is of high quality, but lacks direct measures of eligibility, whereas the 2020 to 2021 Pulse survey contains such measures, but is deemed of low sampling quality by the Census Bureau. The 2020 and 2021 current population survey, for its part, has neither of these issues, but it's smaller. So to make the most of these different data sets, we pre-specified that we would take several approaches for estimating the demographic profile of likely eligible renters. So the CPS method involves simply estimating weighted demographic proportions among a subset of renters who we were able to identify as likely eligible for ERA. Now, the next two methods combine the ACS microdata with the census pulse data. So the ACS method involved using the common variables in both data sets to fit four predictive models of eligibility in the pulse. We used the random forest method as it was able to correctly predict 97% of renters as likely eligible. And then finally, the pulse method reweighted the pulse samples so that it resembles the characteristics of those in the higher quality ACS sample. So next slide. So now I'm going to talk about our results and what we learned from the study. So I want to quickly note that all the analysis was pre-specified in an analysis plan, which can be found on our website, along with the study abstract, as well as a technical appendix. And I saw that, Kim, you dropped that into chat, so thank you very much. So first of all, we found that Black and women renters were overrepresented among recipients of ERA. So Latinx renters received ERA roughly proportionally to their share of the eligible population. And extremely low income renters were also overrepresented. So the proportion of ERA recipients in this category was twice as high as the proportion of eligible renters in this category. Next slide. We also found that consistent with other government benefits programs, Asian renters are underrepresented among recipients of ERA. Those who identified as American Indian and Alaska Native are overrepresented, as are Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. We have no data on non-binary gender identification among the eligible population. Next slide. So finally, I want to speak a little bit about the intersection of income with race and ethnicity. So we found that Black, Latinx, and white renters with extremely low incomes were overrepresented in the program relative to their population share. White and Latinx renters were only underrepresented when their incomes were higher than 30% AMI. Asian renters are moderately underrepresented, about 0.6 to 1% percentage points at all income levels. Next slide. So we want to end here by summarizing the key takeaways. Among those eligible for ERA, Black, women, and extremely low-income renters were the most likely to receive funds. The fact that ERA funds were much more likely to reach those with the lowest income matters for the representation of racial and ethnic groups because income distributions vary by race and ethnicity. OES estimated underrepresentation of white and Latinx renters only at the higher end of the eligible income spectrum. Extremely low income white and Latinx renters are overrepresented among recipients. Underrepresentation of Asian renters actually appears less stark when we take into account income, but persists at moderate levels for all income brackets. And this is consistent with patterns of Asian representation in other benefits programs. So next slide. So we're really excited about the rich data available to retrospectively learn from the ERA program. And we would love to connect with you. So thank you everyone for all the important work that you do. If you have additional questions for us, please let us know. Feel free to send us an email at oes@gsa.gov. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhavya. That was a really helpful overview of important research, and we're glad to hear it and to see it. It's especially heartening to see how emergency rental assistance, has predominantly and disproportionately helped people of color and extremely low-income households, which is exactly what we and many of our partners that are on this call and beyond had set out to do. And as you and many folks on the phone know, that kind of alignment of resources to people with the greatest needs doesn't happen by chance, and especially when working under such extreme time and other pressures, it only happens with really deliberate program design and outreach. So can you say more about, did you in your research identify some of the features that allowed for these kind of outcomes in the program?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so for this research in particular, we did not draw any causal inferences or look at the impact of any particular program decisions or program flexibilities. The goal here was just to kind of do what we pre-specified in the analysis plan, which is effectively what I presented today. But this is something that we're really interested in and excited about looking into going forward. So we're currently in conversation with several ERA grantees to understand the impact of different programmatic decisions from an equity perspective. So it's something our team is really excited about looking into going forward. We know a lot of people are doing exciting work in this area. It wasn't the focus of this particular study.
Great, yeah, and as you probably know, we at the National Income Housing Coalition, we've done a significant amount of tracking and research and analysis of that as well. So we'd be really pleased to work with you on any follow-up analysis that you do on that. There's a question from Helen Renfrew asking what percentage of reporting entities did not report demographics. And she notes that her state's information is missing 20 to 25% of data as not reported.
Absolutely. And just as a quick shout out to your previous comment, we're a big fan of NLHC's various resources. So those have been really useful in our work as well. So thank you for that. With respect to kind of the missingness, so we have at least one demographic report we found for the study for about 88% of grantees. And so for any grantee kind of with one or more report, we use kind of an average of their submitted report in order to kind of fill in for missing reports. So that's kind of the missingness that we currently discuss in the study that's posted online.
Great. And another question from Carrie Hill. It's an interesting one, asking if the disparity, as she calls it, or I suppose the overrepresentation, could be a reflection of additional funds tied into LIHEAP funding. And she says extremely low income with LIHEAP eligibility received an additional payment due to surplus funds.
So again, I can't speak to kind of specific specific program decisions that led to what we found. I think these are questions that we're interested in kind of in the future, but we can't draw any causal conclusions here.
Okay. And I assume the same is true for the question that Nathan is asking about whether you looked at how these funds were advertised by state, city, and county, documents required, ease of applications, et cetera. That's not something that you looked into at this point.
Exactly. Questions we're interested in the future, but not that we didn't look into for this particular study.
Okay. And then last question from Patricia is whether you saw any difference by regions, for example, rural areas.
Yes, so we do have some breakdowns by region. So if you click into our website, you can look at some. We didn't specifically look at urban versus rural, but we looked at different parts of the U.S. And we also have some reports broken down by state. So those are available on our website. Great.
Well, Bhavya, thank you again. Thanks for your research to you and your whole team. And thanks for sharing it on today's call. I appreciate your time.
Of course. Thank you so much for having us.
Take care. Before I turn to our next speakers, I just wanted to briefly note a question that came in from Brian Russell, asking about Hurricanes Ian and Nicole, mentioning that these hurricanes devastated the current housing stock in Central and South Florida, and asking about plans to increase accessible, affordable housing for people with disabilities impacted by hurricanes. And I appreciate you asking that question, Brian. I want to point you to our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, point you and everybody on the call today. We have a Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, which is made up of nearly 900 organizations. Many of them are from communities impacted by disasters in this year and previous years. And that group, that coalition works towards exactly what you're asking about. Related to a complete and equitable disaster housing recovery. So Elena has just put the link into the chat box, and tomorrow, Tuesday at 2:00 is when we have our National Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition call. So I'd encourage you to join that to hear more about disaster housing recovery and ask any questions that related to that you have there. So I'm going to move on in our agenda now, and I'm really pleased to welcome to the call Michaela Connery, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Kelsey, and Susan Popkin, who's an Institute Fellow and Director of the HoUSed Initiative at the Urban Institute. And they are here today to talk about research that they have recently published on national housing needs for people with disabilities. So Michaela and Susan, thank you for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. I am Michaela Connery. I am the CEO of the Kelsey. I am a white woman with brown hair and a striped shirt and gray blazer. sitting in a very tiny phone booth, and really excited to be with you. I am from an organization called the Kelsey. We are San Francisco-based not-for-profit. Our mission is to advance disability-forward housing solutions that both meet the critical and often overlooked housing needs of people with disabilities. And in doing so, builds better communities, better housing, and better opportunities for all people. And we both have a housing development part of our work where we both develop, finance, and build disability forward, inclusive, accessible, and affordable housing, and also lead advocacy and field building to create the market conditions and other systems that can help make inclusive disability forward housing the norm more at scale. So I am somewhat standing in today too for my colleague, Allie Cannington, who's our manager of advocacy and organizing, who really led this work with the Urban Institute and also is who more regularly connects with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So I am representing both of us today, and I'll pass it to Sue.
Hi, I'm Sue Popkin from the Urban Institute, which is a nonpartisan policy research organization. And I'm a white woman with glasses and salt and pepper hair. And I'm wearing a purple sweater, and I'm sitting in front of a Zoom background that says Urban Institute. I am really excited to be talking about this research that we did with the Kelsey. It's a really unique project for us. I am leading the Urban Institute's new Disability Equity Policy Initiative, which is really trying to bring a disability lens across all of Urban Institute's work. And housing for people with disabilities is a major issue that we're focusing on. And this was the inaugural project for our new initiative. So I think, Michaela, you're going to start by summarizing some of the key findings.
I am. And I also will note in advance that there seems to be some work happening outside of this room where there's a toilet flushing every few minutes. So if you hear that in the background, I apologize in advance, but we'll just try our best. But I'm laughing at that. That's my background.
Outside, so we're great.
That's my soundtrack. I will kick us off by sharing some of what led us to this research and some of our key findings. Sue will share more on the research process and then close it with some of the key initiatives and recommendations coming out of that research of what's ahead. Like I mentioned, the Kelsey, has been working on this disability housing focus for several years now. And one of the key challenges is that we have some disconnected pieces of data out there. So the Technical Assistance Collaborative does a great report on people with disabilities who are on SSI and how priced out they are. There's been different studies that have come out. The ARC has done some interesting things on aging caregivers and what's needed there. There's been, a few things here and there from different, the worst case needs assessments and other larger housing studies that have included disability, but we really lack a comprehensive understanding of the housing needs of people with disabilities, which then turns into a real barrier both on the development, but especially on the advocacy and resource securing side of the work to quantify the need to make a case for impact and make a case for the remedies that are needed to solve that. So this had been, on the Kelsey's radar for a long time of beginning, and I say really specifically, which will come more to the recommendations, very specifically that this is beginning a research agenda around housing and disability and how we can start to have a more, robust and clear data set to look at, what is this need? And then most importantly, what can we do to meet this need? A couple principles as we came into the research that Sue will share more on how the process did this, but a couple key principles that we really wanted to look at in this work. One is really looking at cross disability. The Kelsey is, a cross disability organization. We don't sort of target a specific type of disability, and we really wanted to make sure the research considered holistically the diversity of disability within the United States. We do take a particular particular focus in our work on people with disabilities who use supportive services, which we have found to be one of the kind of acute subsets of needs. This research didn't necessarily dive into that, acute subpopulation. It really was the larger population of disability, and Sue can talk more on the data set. The second was the importance of involving people with lived experience in the research development and the consideration of findings, as well as ultimately the implementation of work coming out of this. That's something key to all of the Kelsey's work, and Sue can share more on what that looked like in the process there. And then the third piece was really looking at a national data set, thinking about this across all US markets, and in the future having the ability to break down that work by different geographic focus areas or different cities, so that we could look at it, but it was a national study. I think the key takeaways that we saw in this work kind of fall into three major buckets. The one overarching bucket that we already knew at some level, but this research really drove into it, is the affordability gap for people with disabilities related to the disproportionate experience of poverty, both as individual disabled people who are the heads of their own households, as well as disabled people who are part of a household who that whole household is low income. And so that, we cannot, and this is right aligned with this group here, is that, affordability and disability are intersecting, critically intersecting issues, and that, you can't really look at. There's a lot of people thinking about housing and disability, especially as family-founded groups and other things, that maybe not anchoring as much on how that intersects with the larger affordable housing crisis in this country. And if we, don't talk about disability within affordability, we're missing the mark and missing out on a large population of people. The second is, the access to assistance, and that what we learned in right now in the US is that there are 18 million disabled people who are in the United States who are eligible for housing assistance, but not yet receiving it. And so we know that number is maybe even likely higher, but that there are a lot of people with disabilities who are eligible for assistance, but living without it. And so how do our interventions really make sure that we're both increasing the amount of housing assistance available and making sure the folks with disabilities who need it are getting it. And then the third kind of category of takeaway was really in how this crisis will only grow over time. And what we continue to talk about at the Kelsey is a wave coming to a cliff of what is currently the status quo of disabled people who are living in the household of a different head of household. In many cases, those are family members. We don't have that exact number, but we don't know exactly who that head of household is, but that there are disabled people, 7 million of them, who are living with an adult head of household. So 7 million adults with disabilities are living in the household with another adult head of household who is their relative. So whether that's a parent or a sibling or some other caretaker. And that 52% of those head of households are age 55 and older. And so what that really gets to is beginning to quantify that, in our country, we've done a relatively decent job of closing large institutions and, congregate settings and having those not be the norm. However, unfortunately, what our three data sets kind of show, or three findings kind of show us, is that what we didn't see is those people kind of moving from institutions into community housing. We see a high number of them still within the family home or home of a family member, and that many of those heads of households are aging, where there will indeed be an expiration date on that housing that is available to them through that family member. And so what we see as the need immediate of folks with disabilities who need housing today, that need is only going to grow as these caregivers can perhaps no longer keep these individuals housed within the family home, and also a preference, even if they can keep them there, as disabled people desire to have a home of their own, as is the desire of many people. So those are kind of three of the initial key data points that we're finding. As I kick it over to Sue, I will drop the link in the chat where you can download the full initial needs assessment and be able to look at some of the details on that a little bit more for yourself. And then we'll come back to this, but like I said, this is the initial baseline needs assessment. I think there's a lot more details and crosstabs on this that we hope to continue to look at as we build out of this and continue this research effort. So I'll pass it to Sue on the process.
Thanks, Michaela. I think Michaela did a good summary of our key takeaways, and I wanted to tell you a little bit because this was a really unique project. It's unusual for an advocacy organization like the Kelsey and a research organization like the Urban Institute to partner and co-lead a piece like this. So that was a new experience for all of us, and I think really fruitful because then we have our analytic abilities and the Kelsey's ability to really think about the policy implications and take the research that we've done and use it, which is just great in ways that we can't. This also built on something we're doing. I think I mentioned, and I'll put in the chat also, this is the inaugural publication from our new Disability Equity Policy Initiative at Urban. And one of the things we think is really important as part of an initiative is to lift up empower disabled researchers to do the work and partner with this so that disabled voices are speaking about the policy issues. And also to really make sure that we're engaging with the community as we do this work, that we're using community engaged methods. So we had not only our partnership with the Kelsey, but we had a community advisory board from across the country who helped direct the research, who helped review the research questions, talk to us about what we were missing, and helped us think about how we should be shaping writing up the work, shaping the conclusions. It was a really powerful experience. It was a really challenging experience because what we did in this project was do an analysis of the CPS, the current population survey, which you just heard our last speaker talk about, big national data set with all of its imperfections, which I'll talk about in a minute. But so it was a very quantitative project. This was not a focus group where we were talking to the people in the advisory board to get their opinions and then reporting back out on that. And if you look at the piece I just put in the chat, the homepage, you'll see we have another piece on reasonable accommodations in federally assisted housing that was based on more qualitative research. So it was our challenge to figure out how to share the quantitative findings with the community advisory board and have and share them in a way that they were comprehensible, that they weren't in research speak, that they were something that people could understand. And I think that's something we'll be continuing to learn as we move forward with this project. It is challenging, but they advised us, they looked through the results, they helped interpret the results, and we actually held an online data walk-in wheel where we invited people, other people to come and look at the results while the community advisory board members explained them and interpreted them. And all of that analysis ended up in our fact sheet and helped shape the conclusions. I think one of the things that the CAB reported very early or picked up on very early on is there is no one federal data set, national data set that has a perfect measure of disabled people or the disabled population in the United States. The census surveys all use the same set of measures to define disability. Those exclude a lot of people in and of themselves. Then the surveys miss a lot of people. So we picked the one that we thought we could do the best with. And then since this is a Hauser call, I'll also say none of them have a perfect measure of who's in assisted housing either. So lots of imperfections, but doing the best we could. I think that one thing that's really important to note, and will be something we're thinking about as we move forward, do research, there were some critical missing populations that really matter for getting an estimate of the needs of the disabled population, particularly people who are unhoused, people who are living in institutions, and people who are living in carceral settings. It also does not include information on children under 15. So if there's a household where an adult was caring for a disabled child under 15, we can't tell in the CPS data. So moving forward, we're hoping that we're going to be able to do some more complex analysis that uses some of Urban Institute's modeling capabilities to pull together different data sets. And we'll be able to include some of those populations. And with that, I think, Mikhail, you wanted to talk about the policy implications. So turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sue. So I think one is, Sue mentioned even before I get into the policy recommendations, these are not working. Even before I get into the policy recommendations, one of the key recommendations coming out of this is additional research that's needed. And, one of the most challenging pieces, especially as I go back to one of our initial kind of like subcategories, and as Sue mentions, also folks who are living in institutional settings, I think there's a real gap in the data and perhaps some stronger interagency or cross-sector collaboration between how some of the data sets used to track housing needs and their definitions don't necessarily always easily overlap with the data sets around things like Medicaid or other social services, particularly around Medicaid. And so I will just say that that's, as Sue mentioned, our, next phase of research goals. And I think that's also illuminating of kind of this larger issue around disability forward housing that we see not just in data, but also in how policies are made or how housing is developed and implemented, is that real intersection between the housing infrastructure and the social services or home care infrastructure, that is a theme, whether we're thinking about research or thinking about a policy agenda or thinking about building housing, that interfacing of those two systems is so critical for the people who are being served, and the systems work needs to reflect and better figure out how to do work across those systems together. So I'll make that broader assessment that we've learned here. Going to what we saw kind of on some of the recommendations of what can be done for what we see as more than 18 million people that face significant barriers to housing, that we look at interventions across kind of 4 key areas. One would be increasing tenant and project-based vouchers. That goes to folks who need housing assistance, would be eligible for housing assistance, but are not receiving it. And so that includes increasing things like the Housing Choice Voucher Program in Section 811, which we know we sit here in a group of allies who understand the critical nature of those programs and how to increase that. Increase access to those which provide a really clear path to housing for people with disabilities. And Allie and the consortium on it's no longer Citizens with Disabilities, but CCD Housing Task Force. This is a key area that they're working on, particularly around 811 and how to increase the both, scale of that program and the uptake by states and using it in the distribution of HUD of that program, and making sure it actually gets out and gets to people, and that more resources are within that. The second is more on the development side of creating development subsidies and incentives targeted towards housing for people with disabilities. And this can take many forms. How do we look at both state, regional, and federal housing subsidies that are including targets that incentivize the inclusion of housing for people with disabilities versus sometimes actually the disincentive that people see of serving disabled population. So that could look like, incentives in the tax credit program when people add increased accessibility. It could look like specific development subsidies for housing communities that reserve a certain number of homes for people with disabilities, or other kinds of particular development resources to boost projects that are integrated and inclusive of people with disabilities and that go beyond minimum levels of accessibility. The third is really looking at the Medicaid Home and Community-Based Services Program, and particularly one part of that program, which is housing-related services. And this goes to the interagency partnership, which is really twofold. One is that as we have decoupled housing and services through deinstitutionalization, through things like HoUSed and the ADA that have pushed into integrated community-based housing, and the settings rule, which is a HCBS regulation around encouraging and really mandating community-based housing. We require, parallel investments in both the housing infrastructure through the two resources I just mentioned, development subsidies and project-based and tenant vouchers, and then a parallel robust investment in the services that individuals need to, not just survive but thrive in their own homes. And so that looks like continuing to work with allies who are on the services side to make sure that Medicaid and HCBS in particular is which is the Home and Community-Based Services Program, is well funded, and that states are using their waiver and getting those dollars out to individuals who need them. And then one particular program within HCBS is housing related services, where people can access reimbursable expenses around housing, retention and coordination, and encouraging the utilization of that program. And then the fourth area is to kind of aligned with all three of these is to create pilot funds for programs that create new community-based housing models that are inclusive of people with disabilities. One of the things that we found at the Kelsey in our bridge between both development and advocacy is having real on the ground examples of what good looks like for really, community-based housing that serves people with disabilities. There are examples here and there of, residents being in homes, but whether that is piloting programs that make sure that community-based housing is available for people with significant support needs and who use 24-hour care, and what does that look like, and showing those models or models that demonstrate increased accessibility, or models that demonstrate partnership between housing infrastructure and service providers, models that show ownership and leadership of disabled people in driving new solutions forward, and really all of the above of how can we create pilot funds both in partnership with the public sector, but also outside of the public sector for eventual government adoption and government scale of what does it look like to create demonstration projects to show what a truly disability forward inclusive housing future can and should look like to meet some of these urgent needs and urgent barriers we know to be true. So we are grateful for a lot of the folks on this call, including the National Low Income Housing Coalition, for their ongoing partnership in a lot of this. I know, especially with the CCD Housing Task Force that Ali leads, there's been ongoing collaboration, and I can share our contact form as well if you're interested in signing up or being in touch with us around how to implement some of this work or around partnership. I will say for the Kelsey, we work in markets across the country. So if there's a specific interest on how do we translate some of these needs into local programs or local development, as well as partnering on some of the national advocacy, we would be keen to hear from you, and Ali would be happy to connect further. But thanks for your attention on this. And Sue, I'll leave it to you to close anything out before we go to questions.
I think we've covered it. I'll just kick it back to Diane.
Great, Sue and Michaela, thank you so much. That was a really informative and helpful presentation. And there are many accolades that you'll see in the chat box when you have a chance to take a look at it. Lots of people commenting with gratitude, many people asking for the report itself, which we've shared links to, and asking for recordings of this call, which, just as a reminder, we'll provide to everybody, to our broader network after the call, along with all other recordings and information from this call. But there was a question that came in about criminalization of homelessness and how that would and does disproportionately harm and impact people with disabilities. So the question is, can you share more about how these efforts to criminalize homelessness can harm people with disabilities and what policymakers should do instead?
I can share, that this will not be anything profound, but that we know this to be true. And, actually, there's been really good studies, I'll just say as a parallel, around studies of how disabled students, so I'll just say, are more likely to be harmed through disciplinary action as a student with disabilities. And that research has just been, there's actually been a lot more done, I would say, on the education level. And when that research came out a couple weeks ago, one of the newest studies talking about that, I immediately thought of this and the adults scenario of this, of, you know, this is exactly paralleled of what we see with adults with disabilities, of being criminalized for other things, when actually it's a symptom of their disability, and therefore, and a symptom, not of their disability, I should say, but a symptom of a system that has failed to meet their needs. And so what should public systems do instead? They should invest in housing. I think one of the simplest ones is we take a strong housing first approach. So that project and tenant-based vouchers is, you know, again, this is not news to people on this call. We need to house people and then provide the services that they need to stay housed and it's a lot easier. Many people, we know this to be true, and we've talked to folks, you know, in Santa Clara County, where one of our developments is that there are many folks who are experiencing homelessness who aren't currently within the disability service system. So they might not be identified for their eligibility to receive home and community-based services, whether through, in California, the regional center or the IHSS program. But if we house them, we can actually connect them to services that they would be eligible for, that they just haven't accessed to date. And so thanks for the question. I think those things are deeply aligned.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. Another question is asking about recognizing that the policy solutions you put forward all make a lot of sense, and asking, when it comes to federally subsidized housing or affordable housing that's built with federal resources, why is it that such a small share of those units are accessible? And what can be done to improve those federally subsidized programs to ensure that more units are accessible to people with disabilities?
You want me to take that one? I think, well, the reason so few are accessible is most of them are old and were built more than 40 years ago, before the ADA and the current requirements. And unfortunately, the current situation is it would cost more money than most housing authorities or housing agencies have to make more of their units accessible, so they haven't. And you know, I think this is something you all know very well, the frustration of not getting that additional housing funding, which would have helped improve accessibility. And so I think in the meantime, we're dealing with encouraging housing providers to find other sources of funding and be creative, or wonderful new groups like the Kelsey that are building new housing that is accessible. But the majority of the federal housing stock is not.
And the only thing I'd add on to that is that the deep affordability needs to be coupled with that, which is why the vouchers or other ways to increase the affordability even within those federally assisted units, because we have heard from developers that sometimes they don't fill their disability homes and therefore aren't at the top of the list of saying we need more of these accessible units. But if those homes are at, you know, in many cases, even 40 or 60, 80 AMI of folks with disabilities who are on SSI couldn't afford them, even if they were physically accessible. So it's both and increasing the requirement and making sure that we have funding dollars to make sure that those hit the affordability that our study kind of shows many disabled people require.
Thank you. And then last question, and just in a couple minutes, if you can, which is all we have left for this segment. What's next for the Disability Equity Policy Project?
For this project, we are hoping that we're going to be able to do a more complex analysis that is able to forecast the need for housing people with disabilities going forward, and address some of those gaps that we identified in the analysis, so that we'd be able to. Some of my colleagues at Urban Institute could use their modeling magic to be able to merge some of our big federal data sets, and we'd be able to look at some of these populations that were missing from this analysis. And I think not only give an estimate of the numbers of people, but what the cost would be for housing people going forward. So a more complex analysis. The Disability Equity Policy Initiative at Urban Institute, we are trying to encourage our colleagues across Urban Institute to take a disability equity lens to their work, whatever it is, whether it's in housing, workforce, criminal justice, all the kinds of the health policy, all the kinds of work that we do at Urban, and to make sure, because it's such an important intersectional issue, and we know that people of color are more likely to be economically impacted by having a disability. So looking at those, being able to look at those issues together.
Great, Sue and Michaela, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and share your important work, and appreciate you sharing it today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
All right, next on the agenda is our erase work, and I'm going to turn to my colleague Tori Beret, who's an erase coordinator, who's going to share an update on the erase blueprint that we published for a permanent ERA program. Tori, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Diane. Hi, everyone. Great to see y'all on the call today. So if you could go to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about our blueprint that was published last week on November 17th, which is the Emergency Rental Assistance, a blueprint for a permanent program. So this new report was authored by members of NLIHC's and Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project. And for more than 2 years, the ERASE project has tracked the progress of ERA and collaborated with state partners, local jurisdictions, and program administrators to ensure that emergency rental assistance reached the lowest income and most marginalized renters. And in particular, the ERASE project has sought to ensure that ERA programs are visible, accessible, and preventative. And the new report focuses on identifying those practices and policies that were most successful in realizing this goal. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over each section of the report. There are 5. So in the introduction section of the blueprint, it presents an overview of Treasury's ERA program, surveying its aim and structure, as well as the guidance issued by Treasury concerning the use of ERA funds, Treasury's processes for allocating and reallocating funds, and trends in ERA spending over time. So ERA 1 spending increased each month between April and September 2021, with significant increases occurring in the late spring and early summer of 2021, as shown by the graph that's on the slide here. And between October 2021 and June 2022, or Q4 of 2021 and Q2 of 2022, ERA 1 spending decreased and then plateaued. Very little ERA 2 was spent between April and September of 2021, but rates increased drastically at the end of the year. ERA 2 spending by quarter reached its peak in Q1 of 2022 before decreasing in Q2 of 2022. So the introduction also explores the general impact of ERA funds. The latest Treasury data shows that as of June 2022, nearly $31.8 billion in assistance has been distributed to households and for administrative expenses and housing stability services, while over 6.3 million payments have been made to households. Nearly 2/3 of households receiving assistance had extremely low incomes, and overall ERA programs assisted a high share of Black households. 42% of households that were assisted identified as Black, though Black households only make up 24% of cost-burdened low-income renter households. And in 2021 alone, at least 1.36 million formal evictions were prevented, thanks to a wide range of government interventions, including federal, state, and local eviction moratoriums, policies like expanded unemployment insurance and stimulus payments and emergency rental assistance. Next slide, please. And so then the introduction goes into an overview of our End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project, which seeks to eliminate rental indebtedness caused by the pandemic and to prevent evictions by tracking and analyzing emergency rental assistance utilization, documenting and sharing best practices and toolkits, influencing and shaping program design at federal, state, and local levels, developing key partnerships for outreach and education, and assessing the remaining needs to inform advocacy for long-term investments to end housing instability and homelessness in the United States. The project provided grant funding and technical assistance to 38 state and local partners through an ERASE cohort and facilitated bi-weekly working groups meetings during which members could engage in peer-to-peer learning. After reviewing the RACE project's goals and framework, the section discusses some of the general strategies that have been used by state and local partners in the RACE project, as well as program administrators to ensure the success of ERA. These strategies include partnering with tenants, landlords, and other community members, utilizing ERA program data to track progress and course correct, advancing racial equity through emergency rental assistance, and ensuring program integrity of the ERA programs. Next slide, please. Section 2 of the blueprint explores how ERA programs around the country ensured that ERA was visible to the lowest income renters. So this section really outlines innovations communities have made related to outreach, marketing, and targeting strategies, central to ensuring that assistance reaches households experiencing the worst impacts of the pandemic, especially BIPOC households, and the eviction prevention efforts reach those at the greatest risk of homelessness. So these innovations include engaging trusted community-based organizations for outreach and marketing, conducting outreach to landlords, using data to target outreach and engagement, distributing program information at critical points of intervention and directly to renters, and providing ERA outreach at eviction court. So we've included examples in the report for each of these best practices. I just want to highlight a few. So one was Citizens Housing and Planning Association creating a pilot program to support CBOs in Massachusetts working to prevent evictions and foreclosures due to COVID-19. And then researchers in Utah analyzed ERA and eviction data to better target ERA utilization. Next slide, please. So the accessibility section, or the third section of the blueprint, addresses the barriers many households face in accessing ERA and makes recommendations that future and current ERA programs should adhere to be as simple, flexible, and accessible to the lowest income populations as possible. So recommendations include ensuring adequate staff capacity, infrastructure, and partnerships to process applications and distribute funds equitably and efficiently, prioritizing households to advance equity and assistance, minimizing burdensome documentation barriers, allowing programs to provide direct-to-tenant assistance, streamlining application processing through the use of bulk payments to landlords and utility companies. And a few examples of these recommendations include the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation using several types of public assistance programs to determine whether an ERA applicant was categorically eligible for rental assistance, and the Louisville ERA program issuing payments directly to tenants when landlords were uncooperative. Next slide, please. Additional recommendations for how to ensure accessibility in ERA programs include providing housing navigation services to assist with applications, improving online application systems, and addressing the technological divide in many communities and areas, ensuring language access and providing translation services for non-English speakers, ensuring access for people with disabilities, guaranteeing access to members of rural communities, and ensuring access to Native American communities. So a few more best practices that revolve around some of these recommendations include renters in Illinois being able to apply for ERA through social service agencies funded by the Illinois Department of Human Services, and the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs ERA program making its application website, FAQs, and marketing materials available in the 5 most commonly spoken languages in the state. Next slide, please. So program administrators, community members, and the RACE cohort members have played crucial roles in establishing and supporting programs that braided financial assistance available under the ERA program with other supportive housing services to prevent evictions. In the prevention section of the blueprint, we highlight various practices adopted by cohort members and ERA program administrators to ensure that ERA kept folks stably housed. So these practices include using ERA to pay for prospective rent and other housing services, using ERA to fund housing counseling and housing navigation services, integrating ERA with landlord-tenant mediation programs, supporting coordination between courts and ERA programs to prevent evictions, establishing and enforcing ERA-related tenant protections at the state and local levels, and setting up eviction, diversion, and prevention programs, and utilizing ERA to prevent and end homelessness. So a few more examples include Alabama cohort members coordinating with local continuums of care, several which had pre-existing relationships with landlords and property managers to help facilitate mediation sessions, and the Detroit-based United Community Housing Coalition and its partners participating in information sessions with sitting Detroit City Council members and their staffs to discuss the growing eviction crisis and brainstorm strategies to keep Detroit renters stably housed, which ultimately led to right to counsel legislation being passed in Detroit unanimously, which was really exciting. Final slide, please. So the final section of the blueprint really talks about policy recommendations for keeping these programs permanent and in place. And really ensuring that the progress made in creating this ERA infrastructure over the last 2 years can continue to remain in place. So some such recommendations include establishing and funding a permanently emergency rental assistance program through the Eviction Crisis Act, and exploring the use of innovative models like direct-to-tenant payments to support renters. And then a permanent ERA program is just one part of a needed housing safety net to end homelessness and alleviate housing insecurity among the lowest income renters. It's not enough on its own. So Congress must really act to ensure long-term affordability for the lowest income renters through universal vouchers, preserving and increasing the supply of housing affordable to the lowest income renters, and enacting robust and permanent tenant protections at the state, local, and federal levels. And that is it for my piece. So really excited to be able to share all that information with you today.
Thanks so much, Tori. That was a terrific overview of a really well done report by the whole HoUSed team, by Tori, Sarah G, and many more at the National Income Housing Coalition, and who pulled a lot of information from the HoUSed cohort, and many of you that are on the line today and others who aren't, who have worked incredibly hard in your communities to make these ERA programs so successful. So Tori, there aren't any specific questions that I see here. Lots of thanks and congratulations in the chat box that you should take a look at. So thank you. And thanks to everybody on the line, and more broadly, our partners that worked with us so hard over these last couple of years to make ERA so successful. Thank you, Tori. All right, I'm going to turn now to our next speaker. We're going to turn now to some field updates, and we'll hear first from Jacqueline Zarak-Koryath. I hope I got that right. Who is the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence. Jacqueline, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for joining.
That's great. Thank you. Perfect. There's my slide. So for anyone that I haven't met, and there's a lot of people on this call, so I'm sure there are many of you. My name is Jackie Koryath. I work at the Network. The Network is Chicago-based, but we do statewide work throughout the state of Illinois. I do all of our housing related work. We also run the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, but we do a number of housing programs and educational work and direct services to survivors of gender-based violence, although obviously our name says domestic violence. I've been at the Network for about a year. Prior to that, I was a supervisory attorney at Legal Aid Chicago. And during that time, I also focused on this intersection of housing and gender-based violence. So I'm going to talk to you today about a law we were successfully able to pass in Evanston just a couple months ago. So for people that aren't aware of Evanston, and you may be because it's been in the news a little bit the past year. It's north of the city. You can see where it is on the map there. It's a really desirable location. A lot of people want to live there. In our area, it's also covered by the Housing Authority of Cook County. And so a lot of voucher holders want to live there. There's good schools. It's a relatively diverse community, and it has a number of residents. Also, you have Northwestern University there. And so it makes the housing dynamic really interesting because you have the university students, you have kind of a number of different communities that live there. Like I said, one of the reasons it has been in the news recently was because of some of the reparations work that Evanston's been doing. And I just put a little snip of the news clip about that, just because I feel like it's relevant as we discuss kind of fair housing and how it's been evolving in Evanston over the past year or so. All right, so just again, another picture of Evanston. So the demographics there, you can see on the screen about how the makeup is. It's also what I would describe to be a wealthier area. Medium household income is a little over 82,000. Medium home value is about 409,000. And then of the people that live there, about 67% have a bachelor's degree or higher. And so that's just kind of a snapshot of what the community looks like. So the ordinance that we were working on was through Evanston's Fair Housing Ordinance. And so in order to do that, we had to do it through Evanston City Council. You can see the map of the different wards on the screen. In addition, all of the council members that are associated with those wards, they all serve in 4-year terms. And there were a number that worked with us specifically on this, primarily Claire Kelly, who is in Ward 1, but also Bobby Burns and Devin Reed. So how this came about was, and this is a map of Cook County on the right. So a lot of people think of the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago falls in Cook County in Illinois. You can see the boundary in red there on the map on the right. So in 2019, Cook County passed what was called the Just Housing Amendment, and it amended the Cook County Human Rights Ordinance. And so through that change, which affected Cook County, not just the city, it prohibited landlords from denying a housing application based on arrest records, including juvenile and adult records. And it's provided that a landlord cannot consider criminal history that is more than 3 years old. And that for any criminal history less than 3 years old, the landlord had to do an individualized assessment. There was an exception to this related to the sex offender registry, but it was a big change in how people were looking at justice involvement and rental applications. But if you look at the map, you'll see Evanston falls within Cook County. And so the council members were considering the Just Housing Amendment that had passed, and were like, our fair housing ordinance, Evanston falls within Cook County. This now applies to us. Our fair housing ordinance does not have those same protections in it. And so we should update it so that it's consistent with the ordinance, so that tenants know the protections, so that landlords know what they have to follow. And so council members had reached out to a number of advocates, and it ended up being connected to me, primarily through Gail Schechter. And so who had emailed out to, I think, most of the advocates. I think that's how I got connected here. And so, so I agreed to help the council members update the language along with a number of other partners, including, like I said, Gail Schechter. She currently works at HoUSed, Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, NHLP, and Open Communities. And so while we were updating that, I determined that there was an opportunity to also improve housing access for survivors. So the primary update was to update it consistent with the Just Housing Amendment, which really shouldn't have been a controversial amendment. And it ended up not being that, although I do have some reactions later in the slides. However, like I said, when we were doing that, I was like, well, if we're looking at the protected categories and if we're adding language there already, let's add a category for survivors of domestic violence, because they often experience barriers to accessing and maintaining housing. This would be a good protection in Evanston. It's also notable that Illinois has other protections for survivors. So for example, the Illinois Human Rights Act covers order protection status. The Cook County Fair Housing Ordinance covers housing status. So there was other protections out there, but they weren't as direct as what I thought we could do in Evanston. I'll also note that the amendments to the ordinance created an enforcement provision. So now the city attorney can enforce the ordinance when there's violations. What they used to do before is refer to open communities, and now they have the potential to enforce it themselves. So this is what the new language looks like. It's honestly, it's edited throughout to include all of the amendments to the Just Housing Amendment. It also included some sexual harassment provisions just to make them consistent with federal and state law. And like I said, the enforcement mechanism. But what we did here and is relevant to this presentation was added this language at the end about actual or perceived status as a victim of domestic violence. Actual or perceived is because a lot of times people aren't in a safe place to disclose what's happening to them, although people around them, including neighbors, housing providers, recognize what's happening to them as domestic violence. And so by phrasing it this way, people don't have to, survivors don't have to create an unsafe situation in trying to defend their housing by identifying as a survivor. And I already mentioned this a little bit, but there was these other protected classes in Illinois, including order protection status, but it's important to recognize that not everyone feels comfortable accessing our court system. It's inaccessible to everyone in different communities. And so it's different to have order protection as a protected status versus actual or perceived status of domestic violence, because it's going to cover a lot more people, including, like I said, like communities that typically are concerned about accessing our justice system. So there was a number of reactions to this, although this proposed language wasn't controversial about the survivor status. The main reactions were to the Just Housing Amendment language, which, like I said, shouldn't have been controversial, mainly because Evanston falls within Cook County, so it was going to be covered regardless. It was just a matter of kind of updating Evanston as the puzzle piece that fell within Cook County. And then I think the last thing I have is just next steps. So right now we're trying to get the word out about what it says, doing outreach to landlords, survivors. This is a flyer I made that explains what housing discrimination against survivors looks like. That's important because survivors experience a lot of adverse decisions against them in housing. I have a number of them on there. I mean, eviction is the one that people typically think of, but you also get non-renewals, denial of an accommodation that you might need after experiencing trauma, justice involvement, and we can kind of connect with the Just Housing Amendment there as well. Damages to a unit is a big issue, especially when it's caused by an abusive partner. And so, like I said, we're trying to get the word out about the ordinance so that people know that they're covered now and that they have this additional protection. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask me. I do a lot of work at this intersection and I am happy to answer any of them.
Great, thank you, Jackie. That was a really helpful overview. I'm not seeing questions, although there's kind of a few different conversations happening at the same time in the chat box, so I could be missing something. I see one from CJ O'Hara asking about whether these numbers are coming from the last census or from another source from the earlier part of your presentation.
Hey Chris, how are you? Those were from the 2021 census.
Great.
Sorry, I meant to say that when I was on the slide, so I'm so happy you asked that question.
Great. I think that's all the questions for now, Jackie. So thank you so much for your work. Really appreciate your leadership on this, and I appreciate you sharing this today. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
We'll turn now to Andrea Davis, who's Executive Director from HoUSed, for another field update. Andrea, thank you for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
You're very welcome, Diane, and thank you. Just a little note of clarification, HoUSed is spelled with as an O. You can see that in my email address. So if anybody is looking online, it's a very common misunderstanding with the origins of our organization, but it's HoMEWORD. As Diane mentioned, I'm the executive director of HomeWord. We're an organization that has been around for close to 30 years here in Montana. We build homes that Montanans can afford, and we are also a housing counseling agency. We do our development work around the state of Montana. We have built in about 13 different Montana communities, and we are a housing counseling agency in the greater Missoula area, which is the second largest city in the state, which, you know, city is all contextual here in Montana, since we are quite rural. In fact, what would be considered a frontier state, given the length of distance between some of our communities and larger communities. We do quite a bit of policy advocacy and housing advocacy as well, and have been really pleased to work with the National Low Income Housing Coalition on the HoUSed campaign priorities. I personally chair the Montana Housing Coalition, and the Montana Housing Coalition advocates for a cohesive state housing policy, and really we're advocating for state resources. Montana is one of a handful of states in the country that put little to none of its own resources in programs to build rentals or for sale homes affordable to Montanans. We are in a very unique situation, as many of you and all of you are here, I think, with the lack of affordable options and what we're seeing happen with escalating rental and for sale purchase price amounts. Our Governor Gianforte, formed a housing task force in the summer of 2022, so just this past summer. And the executive order around the housing task force was quite specific to the need to increase homeownership options and the need to conduct regulatory reform. There are two different reports that were the task force was tasked with. One was on October 15th. That report was recommendations that would require legislative action and that the governor could sign into law. And then December 15th, so here in just a few weeks, there will be a report on agency improvements and best practices from other states. I would say that the majority of effort was, I'll be interested to see what comes out for the December 15th report. A lot of energy and effort went into the recommendations provided in that first report. I did not sit on the housing task force, although our vice chair did. And the report has 18 recommendations organized in 3 overarching strategies. 1, regulatory reform. 2, incentives to encourage regulatory reform. And 3, investments in improved government efficiency, workforce development, and private sector home construction. The task force was broken down into 4 sub-task working groups. They worked fast and furious. Folks were asked to convene quickly and provide recommendations very quickly. So I will say that there was not a lot of time to develop a lot of informed recommendations. So they vary quite a bit in terms of some depth, and then, but there was opportunity for the public to participate all throughout this process. The task force report importantly recognized the need to address below market rents and homes to purchase. It noted that market rate sector alone cannot address the needs for home affordability for all Montanans, that there is a need for capital, and it noted that this was a necessary and ongoing effort. All 3 of the Montana Housing Coalition's legislative priorities were included in the task force recommendations. Those are creating a state low-income housing tax credit. I'll just note for the participants, we did get that passed in 2021, but it was vetoed by the governor. Our second legislative priority is to allocate money to an existing Housing Montana fund. It's been around since 1999. It just doesn't ever get any money in it. And then 3, to allocate funding to a multifamily coal loan program. Number 3 exists because we needed to find money somewhere. And so we have a coal trust from the excavation of coal, natural resources here in our state. And it generates, it's $1 billion trust. And so the interest from that generates money. And we managed to get $15 million allocated in 2019 to support multifamily rentals. All of that money, of course, was immediately spent. And so we're looking to get more money into that program. Importantly, the recommendations for the state low-income housing tax credit in the report tie it as an incentive to local zoning reform. And it's an issue in our state because there was quite a bit of state preemption of local jurisdictional control in 2021. And so there's a lot of concern by the Montana Housing Coalition membership, not only about state preemption of local jurisdiction, but also just how would zoning reform actually look across a very large state and in communities that look very different. The housing coalitions, we're encouraging that if there is a low-income housing tax credit bill that is tied to local zoning reform, that instead of it being a prescriptive list of criteria, that it actually be a menu of options that local municipalities and jurisdictions could choose from. So we're hopeful that if that's the direction it's going to proceed in the 2023 legislature, which starts just in January, that that there is some flexibility for local government. The message that we're getting from the governor's administration and the majority in the legislature is that housing affordability is a market issue, that it's pretty much all supply and demand. I think, there's many of us that would argue that the market alone cannot solve for this issue for all Montanans. And we concur zoning and land use needs to be addressed. Tying it to a state housing credit or other housing program, however, could really stall out the program from making impact immediately. And of course, we know we need these homes now. We are seeking common ground, as I mentioned, of developing a menu of options. The political landscape is going to be interesting as we move forward. The message we're hearing from the budget director is that that he is not a fan of tax credits, although they did pass a film tax credit. As many of you know, you probably watched Yellowstone, the movie, and certainly Paramount was successful in getting a film tax credit passed the last session. And also there are some tax credits for other things that are being proposed in the governor's budget priorities that were just released last week. Housing, however, is not one of them. Where I sit today, Missoula is one of the highest rate of increases in the country, where we have seen home prices escalate in less than 12 months from $350,000 median home purchase price to $550,000 purchase price. It's not just Missoula, it's happening all over the state of Montana. And so that really is it in a nutshell. I would say that we're very pleased to see that there was actually a task force that convened. This is an issue that didn't crop up overnight, and we're hopeful that we'll see a lot of attention on this. Housing by far is the #1 issue in our state right now. And so we're going to continue advocating both at the state level and at the federal level for some more resources. And I know that we're close on time, so I'll go ahead and wrap up my comments there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. One question that came in that I did want to ask you came from CJ O'Hara, asking how many continuums of care exist in Montana and whether they have a community roundtable or other ways to stay in touch regarding key issues or concerns.
We have one statewide continuum of care that actually applies to HUD for HUD funding. There are more or less local continuum of care, and the actual number I would have to go and get back to you on that. I know that it's less than 10, however, that are organized locally. Like in the community I live in, Missoula has its own continuum of care, but it does not apply to HUD directly. It applies through a statewide continuum.
Got it. Thanks so much, Andrea. I really appreciate your work and your partnership, and I appreciate you joining today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. So I'm going to turn now to Sarah Sadian. We are running a little bit over time, or we will be in just a couple minutes, but I want to encourage everybody who can to stay on. And for those of you who can't, to know that Sarah will give her full update on impacts of the elections on our housing agenda and what's next in the lame duck session and what you need to do to act. And we'll have it all recorded and we'll share it afterwards so you can watch the archived version. So Sarah, thanks for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I'm gonna ask our partners to move along with our slides to the next one. So I want to talk about 2 legislative opportunities that we have between now and the end of the year and what advocates can be doing to help advance housing policy. The first is going to be through the annual appropriations process, and the second is tax extenders. And after we talk about what happens in lame duck, I can talk a little bit about the election and what it means for us next year. So first, just to say that Congress is operating under a continuing resolution through December 16th to keep the government open while it negotiates for final spending bills. As you know, the fiscal year started October 1, and they've kept the government open until December 16th with the plan of hopefully passing a final bill by then. It seems very likely that Congress will need another extension of their continuing resolution. We hear maybe a 1-week extension that would push them right up against the holiday recess, Christmas holiday. So there's going to be as much pressure on policymakers as possible to reach a deal. There is a lot of stake right now when it comes to the spending bill, and so it's a really important time for advocates to be weighing in. We know that conversations are happening right now about how to fund housing programs and how much they should get. One clear example of what's at stake is with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. The House proposed 140,000 new vouchers. The Senate proposed less than 5,000. And so this is a place where your advocacy is definitely needed. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide and go to the next slide to talk a little bit about how advocates can weigh in. First, I want you to take out your phone, use this QR code. It'll bring you to the national sign-on letter in support of the highest levels of funding possible for HUD programs. If you aren't already signed on to the letter now, it's a great time. You can use a couple minutes right now to sign your name on. We're going to be sending an updated version of the letter to appropriators as soon as possible. So we want to show them that there's a lot of support for these programs. Other ways that you can take action, you could be reaching out to your members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, and ask them to support the highest levels of funding possible. You can ask them, for example, to increase the number of households that are able to receive rental assistance. We know that many people are struggling to pay rent right now. They're struggling with inflation, with increased evictions, with increased homelessness. And one of the quickest ways we can get assistance to those households is by expanding rental assistance. So we need to make that point, both Republican and Democratic members of Congress. If you have a member that is on the Appropriations Committee, you have an especially important job ahead of you, since those are the folks who are making the key decisions about funding levels. Again, because all of these bills have to get 60 votes in the Senate, you want to make sure you're not leaving out your Republican members of Congress. They're incredibly important to have on board when it comes to passing a final spending bill. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about opportunities to reform and expand the low-income housing tax credit. Congress is likely to take up by the end of the year, or could take up by the end of the year, a tax extenders package. That's a bill that would extend various tax provisions that are about to expire, and housing advocates are making the case for both expanding the low-income housing tax credit by lowering the 50% test for bond finance deals, or extending the 12.5% boost that was given to the program in 2018. But also there's a chance here to reform the low-income housing tax credit. We at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition support expansion, but we think it's just as important that Congress reforms the program so that people with the greatest needs, people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, can also benefit from those increased resources. We know that without those sorts of reforms, the low-income housing tax credit is just not enough on its own to build or preserve homes that are actually affordable to people who need it the most. Next slide. So just a word on the reforms that we're pushing for. There are a couple that would enable deeper income targeting within the low-income housing tax credit. We want to expand the basis boost that's given to developments that set aside at least 20% of their units to be affordable to extremely low-income renters. And we want to make sure that 8% of all tax credits are used to build those buildings. Both of these set-asides and the basis boost would make it easier, a little bit more financially feasible, to build projects that are serving people who have the greatest needs. Next slide. We also want to make sure that both rural and tribal communities can better access the low-income housing tax credit, and by designating them as difficult to develop, It means that those communities would also be eligible for a 30% basis boost, again, to help make those deals more financially feasible and to make sure that those communities can benefit from the program as well. Next slide. We love QR codes here now. I'm going to encourage you to take out your phone again and use this QR code to go to our Take Action page. It's going to bring you lots of options, but one of them is to send an email to your members of Congress about the need to expand and reform the low-income housing tax credit. In terms of timing, your work between now and the end of the year is most important. It's a little unclear about what's possible given the outcome of the election. I hear lots of different things depending on who I talk to, but it's really important that if there is an opportunity at the end of the year, that we're really taking advantage of it and making sure that people who have the greatest needs can benefit from expanded resources. So now is the time for you to be talking to your members of Congress. Again, you want to talk to both Republicans and Democrats. And if you have a member who is on the Senate Finance Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee, you have a really important job here because they're the ones who are going to be putting together that draft legislation. Next slide. To help you with your work, just a reminder that we have lots of resources that you can use. We have an advocacy toolkit and many fact sheets, our budget analysis, our state housing profiles. You'll get a copy of this PowerPoint too, so that you can click on those links and use them in your advocacy. Next slide. So just a word on the outcomes from the midterm elections and what that means for housing. As you know, Republicans have won a very slim majority in the House. Democrats, on the other hand, won one more seat in the Senate. There's also a runoff still in Georgia. And so what we're seeing ahead of us is a split Congress. What does that mean for housing? Well, one, it means it's going to be very difficult for Speaker McCarthy to govern next year, and that's because there's really no room for error. Hardliners in his party are going to be pushing for Republicans to use their leverage to advance their policy priorities and to block President Biden's agenda. I'm going to talk about that in a couple minutes to see what share more about what that means. I think it does mean that it's going to be very hard to see substantial legislation get enacted next year. House Republicans don't have a ton of incentive of delivering President Biden a victory, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of cooperation. At the same time, this is going to be a time where both Republicans and Democrats are going to be showing the American people about what they would do if they were in charge of the House, Senate, and White House in advance of the 2024 election. So I think that means that there will be an opportunity for us to advance legislation in the Senate, coalesce Democrats around a shared housing vision and needed solutions, even if it's going to be very difficult to see that happen on the House side. Next slide. We're going to skip these slides if that's okay, until we get to commitment to America. Perfect. I want to share a little bit about what we know about what House Republicans are going to pursue next year. We know a little bit based on a document that they released called Commitment to America. It's a blueprint that calls for what they say cutting wasteful spending, cutting taxes and regulations, eliminating welfare incentives, reducing crime and protecting public safety, and holding Washington accountable. Next slide. I think what that means for us is that the biggest threat ahead of us is the threats to spending cuts. It's very clear that Republicans next year will have the most leverage when it comes to demanding cuts either to domestic programs, maybe even entitlement programs, in exchange for passing regular spending bills or lifting the debt ceiling. And we've seen this before. You may remember after the 2010 midterm elections when Republicans took control, they were able to force Congress to put in place the Budget Control Act, which caused 10 years of low spending caps for domestic programs, including housing programs. And while Congress was able to reach agreements to provide some temporary relief to those spending caps, those caps largely prevented Congress from funding housing programs at anywhere near the amount that's needed. So this is very top of mind for us as we're looking ahead to next year. Next slide. The other place that I think we'll see harmful proposals is within the House Financial Services Committee. It's very likely that we're going to see oversight of COVID relief funds, possibly state and local fiscal recovery funds and emergency rental assistance. There will be investigations into the Biden administration. But what I'm also worried about is that there will be new threats to housing first next year. This past year, we've seen many times Republicans have offered amendments and bills that would undermine HUD's ability to use evidence-based solutions to addressing homelessness, and that would redirect funds to higher barrier, costly, less effective programs. So it's really important that you're using this time now before 2023 to talk to your members of Congress about housing first and solutions to homelessness. There are a lot of resources that we've created that you can be using. We'll share links to them after this presentation, but it's really important that you're talking to both Republicans and Democrats. On the Republican side, to educate them about what housing first is, to explain to them about what the causes of homelessness really are and what the solutions are. And then on the Democratic side, to shore them up, to make them feel really comfortable with protecting housing first going next year. We're going to need a lot of advocates and allies there. The other place that I think we're going to see harmful legislation is around work requirements and time limits. We may see again a proposal from President Trump's HUD Secretary Ben Carson. You may remember he put out legislation that would have raised rents on households that have the lowest incomes and put in place rigid work requirements and time limits that really only serve to keep people out of housing and don't do anything to address the underlying causes of the housing crisis. So that's something that we're going to have to continue to pay very close attention to and make sure that we are responding to. I wouldn't necessarily bring this up with your members of Congress right now. Let's wait and see. But it's something that I think we'll have to respond to quickly when it does come. The other things that we saw under the Trump administration that might come back again next year are measures around restricting access for households with mixed immigrant status, or to allow shelters to discriminate against transgender people who are experiencing homelessness. These are all deeply concerning and things that you should have on your radar. Next slide. So a couple of takeaways about next year. One, I mentioned that it's going to be very hard to govern with such slim majorities in the House and Senate. Two, that the place where I think we have faced the greatest risk is around spending cuts, where Republicans might push for spending cuts to housing and other programs in exchange for passing the regular appropriations bill or raising the debt ceiling. We might see other harmful legislation in the House Financial Services Committee that we'll want to respond to. But on the other hand, we might have an opportunity, especially with Senate Democrats, to highlight the need for additional investments in affordable housing and to put forward and coalesce Democrats around the solutions that we think are most needed. Of course, it goes without saying, all eyes are going to be on the 2024 presidential race, even though we have 2 years left of this Congress or this upcoming Congress. But I think that means it's going to be a very difficult and challenging political environment for all of us. So with that, I will just thank you guys all for being on this call. We look forward to working with you in the lame duck and preparing for next year. And we appreciate you joining with us. Talk to you soon. Thank you.